And welcome to our school event for 5 Days of Memorial by Sheri Fink, this year's One Book, One Community selection. We're lucky enough to have Dr. Fink here, along with Josh Rollerson from WHIS, who's going to interview her. I'd like to thank some sponsors here before we get going. Allegheny County, Dollar Bank Foundation, Highmark, and WYEP 91.3 FM. So let's welcome our guests.
Thanks all again for coming. Thanks for joining us remotely, everybody that's here. And especially thank you for Dr. Sheri Fink for being here. You know her as a reporter for ProPublica, for the New York Times most recently, and of course author of 5 Days at Memorial, your second book, I believe. Also a medical doctor and someone who has worked in disaster settings, so comes at this topic with quite a bit of expertise and experience, first-hand experience, I should say. So welcome, Sheri Fink. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you guys. I was just actually thinking back to when I was in school and some of the reasons I became a writer. And when I was younger than you guys, like in elementary school, there was a somewhat famous local poet who came to our school, and they had a poetry contest, and we got to kind of submit our poems. And mine, among a few others, got chosen to be published in the newspaper. And it wasn't my favorite of the poems that I submitted. I thought it was one of the, less quality ones. And they mistyped a word. It was my first time getting, my stuff published and having an editor screw it up. But I think there was something about, getting work out there, communicating with a wider public that was very enticing and must have done something psychologically that helped guide me to my current position. So in any case, I remember having school visits and finding that quite interesting.
So did you kind of set out to be a writer then, and these other things just happened fortuitously?
Maybe, I don't know. At one point I decided that I really wanted to be a physician and a medical scientist, and that's why I did the medical and science degrees. And then I took a year off, which a lot of people do sometimes, like after college, during college, and I did it the year after med school. And that's a pretty noise. Do you guys hear that a lot? So I went on this year off and was in the Balkans. Now probably a lot of you guys, maybe there are certain causes that are near and dear to your hearts, and things. It could be a local cause, or it could be the war in Darfur or Syria, or all sorts of things happening in the world. And when I was in medical school, it was Bosnia and the Balkans, and there were these awful wars there in the 90s, as you remember. And so I decided, I got really interested in that, and I ended up, after the Bosnian War, I wanted to spend a year there looking at how, I had gotten in contact with med students. Back then it was the early days of the internet, and so it was really amazing to email students who were going through this war. And then they had this conference just after the war, and they invited med students from around the world to come and learn from them. Like, what did they learn? Here they were, just imagine, like students your age who are in a war zone, and how amazing or mind expanding that is to email them and hear what they're going through. So then they invited us to come out after, and they said, here's what we learned kind of doing war medicine. And I was so struck by what I learned when I went there that I said I'd take a year off after school and go there and research this topic of medicine and war. And that ended up, it's like a whole long story after that, but I wrote a book about some of the people who I met there, and then I kind of never went back into clinical practice myself. One thing happened after another, and my life went in a very different direction. But I always did love writing. That's true from the beginning.
And I want to come back a little later on maybe and ask you to talk about the comparison between your experience in Bosnia and what you learned about what happened in New Orleans during and after Katrina, because this term war zone gets thrown around quite a bit, and I'm really curious about in what ways you feel like that's an apt analogy. But maybe we can come back to that in a little bit.
Sure.
We sort of chatted briefly before you got here, and there are a number of things that the students want to talk about too, so there will be a Q&A opportunity as well.
Great.
But first, can you just tell me how you came by this particular story and how, what drew you to it, how this became a big project for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, how many of do you guys remember Katrina when it was actually happening? Just curious. Yeah. Yeah, sort of. It was big news. You guys were like this big. But so one of the big things that was in the news right away were these, I don't know, just that these hospitals, these places that we all think of as our safety zone if there is an emergency, or if we get injured at a time of a crisis, we would think that the hospital would be the one place that we could go. And so, of course, it was very striking when a bunch of hospitals were surrounded by water, people had to be rescued from them, and people died in them. More people than usually die in a hospital. And so very early on, the CNN reports about the rumors at this one hospital, what might have happened there, the doctor, nurses saying they thought that patients might have been, their deaths might have been hastened. That was shocking. And it was all over the news for a very brief time period. And I had just written that first book that you referred to about this war hospital in a foreign country. And then Katrina happens. And I was there as an aid worker. I volunteered with the Red Cross just after, and I'm thinking, like, I've been to all these foreign disasters, and here's something in my own country, and many of the similar themes about rescue coming too late and resources not matching needs, and then the story of this crisis in the hospital. And so I just thought, what happened there? And it was not clear that this alleged event had occurred, but one thing that I learned as a grad student in science, those of you who might be interested in becoming a scientist of some sort, what you do when you like if you're going to get a master's or a PhD, is they ask you to pick one project. So of course you have classes just like in high school, but then you have your own research project. And one of the keys there is they say, pick a project when you're a student that either way that it comes out, it's going to contribute to knowledge, or it's going to be interesting. So if your theory ends up being borne out, this drug is helpful, like that's going to be great. But if it's not helpful and it was expected to be helpful, that's going to help other scientists, or, as an example. And that's how I felt about this case. I felt like finding out what really happened in this hospital, whatever actually happened, was going to be very interesting and really important for us to learn for our country going forward. Because just the fact that doctors and nurses discussed euthanasia, that they thought it might have happened, that meant something went really wrong in this place. And so it's like, what can we learn from this tragedy? And so that's how I got into that story.
I'm very curious about your conclusions on these. Your journalistic distance is impeccable throughout the book. It's you're not editorializing at any point. But I just assume you must have very strong feelings about a lot of the things that happen there, and that was one of the things I was hoping we could get into. Whether we want to talk about euthanasia in the abstract as something that's defensible or not, just at the level of what actually happened, you talk a lot about how the difference between a crime and ethically defensible medical practice has to do with really subtle nuances of intention. So just at the level of journalism, how do you even establish the what happened, the tick-tock of it, with all these different sources, so much material? I just asked you 10 questions at once. Pick one.
That's good. I can choose the one I want to
answer.
It was challenging, especially because these are allegedly criminal events. So you can imagine the people at the center of those events are being told by their lawyers, don't talk to anyone, understandably. And so a lot was hidden. There was like a lot of legal back and forth around even the records being made public, because news organizations wanted those records. These were events of public importance, and so therefore you can argue that the privacy of them, should be, that it's more important that they be made public, but they weren't. So there were a lot of challenges on that level. But I think, we can come away with very secure in the idea that patients' deaths were intentionally hastened, because two people who participated in injecting the patients told me that that's what they did. And there's no reason for them to be lying, because they put themselves at some risk by admitting that on the record, or by saying that on the record. And I really think they were very brave to be honest about it and explain why they thought at the time that this was the right thing to do. So, you know, and there were other people there who said, no, this was all about comfort. And it could very well be that in their heads it was. Or it could be that that's what they had to say, because that interpretation of events allows it to be both a legal and an ethical act. If you're giving medicine to comfort someone and it happens to push them over the edge, well, it's still considered ethical if it's not your goal to kill them. If you're giving them just enough to, you know, deal with some horrible suffering, then that's considered ethical in American medical practice. So that's the way they had to argue it for it to be acceptable. But it also could very well be that some people really felt that was what they were doing. And that's part of why this is so fascinating, right? Because there's so many different ways that you can look at it. And in terms of my own personal opinion, which I, of course, get asked about a lot, I want you guys to think about it and to come to your own conclusions. I don't want to bias you. Obviously, we can have a whole debate about whether it's possible for a writer to really have no biases. I think that's not true. We all come from where we come from. We all bring our unconscious, kind of unintentional way of looking at the world. And you find as you get older, especially when you start traveling or going other places, just how differently different people look at the world. And we kind of assume the way we grow up, it's kind of everyone sees the world through the same frame we do, but actually it's really, really different. And so in any case, I wouldn't ever claim to be unbiased because, you know, well, I would say I'm unbiased to the extent that none of them are my friends. I don't have any dog in the fight, you know. It's not like I need to prove that euthanasia happened or murder happened. I'm not a prosecutor. Nobody was paying me to come to some conclusion. So I don't have any of those types of biases. I'm not one of the people involved who has an interest in making myself look good, you know. So I was able to come to it with that level of objectivity. But then we all have our own just, you know, subconscious or whatever. And I think that hastening death did happen. The evidence shows that it did. Some people involved. And I think that this idea that it was the only choice at that time, that I reject, because I think it's very clear the helicopters were coming. There were ways to move people. You know, but I do feel like maybe some people there didn't see that they literally were blind to the possibility at that point because they hadn't slept in days. They were exhausted. They were seeing people dying. They felt like some of them were like terrified for their own lives. So I do feel like in that state of mind, they may not have seen that in fact help was on the way, help was there. There were other possibilities. If people really were going to die, you could stay with them for a day or two. Other people could fly in, you know.
Well, it seemed like some people thought that they were going to be forced to leave by these mysterious uniformed people that keep showing up and barking orders.
Yeah, so that's true too.
I don't get the sense from reading the book, and especially the whole second half, the sort of the dramatic arc is, will they or will they not be charged? Will they go to jail? And I don't get the sense that you're rooting for either side. In fact, you know, you seem sympathetic to these healthcare workers, but it does seem, and tell me if I'm reading you right, that there is some regret that maybe that charges were not brought not for the sake of punishing these people, but that an opportunity was missed to have a discussion that really needs to be had about these topics. Do you feel like we would be better off as a society had we had this sort of public dialogue if these cases had gone to trial?
Well, I mean, I think we're having it now. Right. The danger was that all the records and the information wouldn't be there and we couldn't know what actually happened. And I think you need to know the facts to be able to have a discussion about it, because these are real events. It's not a theoretical case study. It's real. And so I did resent or think I don't know if resent's the right word. I did think it was really unfortunate that people tried to hide evidence, that people tried to cover up or lie. That just doesn't serve the public. These are events that we can all learn from, and it's a shame to try to, out of self-interest, maybe try to cover that up or hide it. It's understandable, but it's frustrating. And then that's my bias as a journalist. I want the truth to come out. I have the strong belief that that's in our interest as a society. But there are individual costs to that for the people involved. So yeah, no, I don't think you need a trial necessarily for truth to come out, and in fact, there's debates about that, because have you guys studied the history of war crimes courts versus truth commissions? Is that something you're familiar with? No. So there have been some really huge, mega human rights / war crimes that have taken place in the last few decades. So places like Rwanda, where there was a genocide, South Africa, where there were many, many years of apartheid, and then after something like that is over, there's this question of how does society get over it and go beyond it. So in Rwanda, there was a war crimes trial, and some of the people at the center of these horrific events, genocide, which is the worst crime in the world, trying to kill a whole people based on religion or ethnicity or whatnot. And so you can address that through the courts. That's one way, and try to put the bad people away. Or you can do it, say it's through the whole society, and you'd have to put half of society away. Another way that it's been done, in South Africa, is they had a truth commission. And so kind of in exchange for people being honest about the crappy, horrible, horrendous things that they did, then they would go through this sort of truth commission, and they would say what they did, and there was a version of this in Rwanda as well for lower level crimes, and then the idea is that society gets to learn about it, and the people apologize, and they don't go to jail necessarily. And so there's some people who argue that the criminal process, which is information comes out specific toward whether someone's guilty or not, may not even provide that whole picture of truth. So you could imagine ways of getting to truth with or without that trial.
Yeah, when you have these settlements where there's a gag order, and so it explicitly prevents the truth from getting out, even though the interested parties, it's resolved for them in some degree, but the larger society doesn't get the answers that we need.
Yeah, it's true. That's very unfortunate.
Let me quickly just let people know, remind people remotely that we do have a Twitter hashtag going for this event. So if you have Twitter questions, it might be a good time to start formulating them so we can go to them in the Q&A section. But the hashtag is Fink Live. So we'll go to those.
That makes me feel very
as
famous.
They come in. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Saturday Night Live, Fink Live.
If I could press you on one more thing about your personal stake in all of this. We were talking before you got here again about sort of how emotionally difficult this was to read for many of us. It's really harrowing in places. I can only imagine it must have been similarly difficult for you to learn about all these things and then try to write about them. Was that hard?
Yeah, well, in a way, I lived with the story every day in my head for years, trying to reconstruct it, and whenever I would start to feel the least bad for myself, I would just think about, I didn't have to live it, it's the same with a lot of the traumatic subjects that I work on. It's the people who actually went through them, who were involved, whose lives were involved, whose homes were destroyed, who lost family members. That's an order of magnitude more. And if you just remind yourself of that, it's really helpful. But I think I want to salute you. I think to take on this story in high school is a pretty major thing. It's like facing some pretty grim realities in the world, and so I hope you guys can come out with some positives from it too, because as you saw in the book, there's a lot of heroism as well, and that's the other thing that keeps me going. Then I've worked in wars and refugee situations, and latest writing about Ebola, which is a horrible tragedy, but always in those situations, while there are people that you kind of see the worst in humanity sometimes at those times, but you also really see incredibly inspiring acts and just like wonderful self-sacrifice and humanity. And so that's super uplifting. I think these crises are a chance for people to really shine as well. And there's this saying that one of the disaster experts, Erwin Redlener is his name. He's kind of famous in the disaster medicine field. And he says, it's wonderful to have heroes. We shouldn't need so many heroes. So that's like the larger lesson is if we're more prepared, we don't need to have all this heroism. But the heroism is very inspiring.
Can I just ask you process questions as a journalist? I'm just astonished at how much effort must have gone into this. The interviewing, the record keeping, the weaving all of these chronologies together into a single timeline that makes sense. Can you talk about that and how much? Did you have some support? I hope some help with all of this.
A little bit, yeah. And I'm sure you guys couldn't relate to it. Like when you have a paper to write and you have a ton of info that you have to somehow how do I make all that stuff go into this paper and then make it sound good so that the teacher can read it and understand it? And so it's a version of that same thing. A book is just like a longer version of that awful facing the page. Oh my God, what do I do now? But the things that you learn about in school about how to shape a story and even when you study books and how they're crafted, then that's the kind of thing that as a writer I drew upon from my education. And so there are ways to do it. There are ways to organize information. It's wonderful to live in the computer age where I could remember a keyword somebody told me and just type it in the search box and pull up that interview and be able to quote from it rather than have volumes of paper to search through. But yeah, it's a challenge, and I like the detective part. I like the gathering the information part, and so gathering all those details, that was kind of the fun part. Yeah. And the writing part was the part where you kind of get the Velcro, put it on your butt, put the other piece on the chair, and force yourself to sit there and just get it done.
It's a good tip.
Yeah, Velcro on the ass.
How did you get these people to talk to you, some of them? I was astonished to go through the endnotes and see that you pretty much spoke with all of these people.
Can I say that word on webcam?
You just did.
On the butt, sorry, on the butt.
Was it hard to get...
Never heard the word.
No, it's all new to them.
Yeah.
We'll bleep it somehow. Was it hard to get these people to talk to you that had so much to lose and were so heavily lawyered up?
Yeah. And I think it is hard. I had on my side time. So a project that takes a long time, sometimes that gives a chance for things to change and people's circumstances to change. So after that grand jury process was over, that allowed more people to speak because there was no appetite anymore for prosecution in the city. So people felt a little more comfortable at that moment, and just persistence and also trying to explain where I was coming from with the book. So yeah, but it wasn't simple.
Is there the feeling in New Orleans now that this has kind of passed by, or is there still another shoe waiting to drop potentially?
I don't know. I think that personally, I did never expect that there would be more prosecutions because of the article or because of the book. After the article came out, you guys read the article, is that right? Yeah. So after that came out, the local prosecutor did ask Coroner Minyard to open the case of Janie Burgess and look at what Ewan Cook did, Dr. Cook, when he basically said, "I killed her," in the newspaper. So the coroner, as you remember, very political guy. There was an election coming, so he waited till after he was reelected coroner, because this was a very hot button thing. And then he came out with his decision, and he said, it's still an undetermined death. And I said, okay, yeah, that's fine. I'm just curious, though, he said he killed her, so how did you decide it wasn't homicide? And he said, well, Dr. Cook might have thought he killed her, but I can't prove it. So it's indeterminate. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, but it's politics there and such. And again, there wasn't any, they used that case. They used that, the people who were fighting the Jane and John Does not to let the records come out. At that moment, that went up and down to the Supreme Court of Louisiana. I mean, it was fought for years and years over whether those records of the investigation could be released. And they were just at this point where they had to prove, the last point was the only way they could keep it still under wraps was to prove that there was a chance the cases would be reopened. So they used that article to say, well, look, at any moment, new info could come out, so we have to keep this all under wraps because, like now we have to investigate Dr. Cook for this Janie Burgess case. So they used it successfully to keep the records from being released. So that was part of the whole
Used it
the whole thing.
kind of cynically then? Do you think it could actually...
Depends on your point of view.
Right.
Some people thought
like a journalist.
that it was
well done.
cynical, but yeah.
Are we doing okay on time? Great. Okay. Can we talk about, since you just fresh off the plane from covering Ebola, I think, in West Africa, and mentioned the Bosnia reporting, can we draw some connections, comparisons? In what ways does what you learned about New Orleans during and after Katrina compare with what you've seen in other parts of the world in more or less extreme settings?
So can you be more specific, please?
To go back to the point I raised early on, you've reported from an actual war zone, a war hospital. Does it make sense to think about the situation at Memorial in those terms?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, my first book was about a Bosnian war hospital that I was not at. It was a narrative reconstruction. So that meant 5 years of interviewing everyone, gathering up, videotape that they had taken, any kind of evidence. And then just like in this case where I wasn't at the hospital, reconstructing it. And that's the kind of book that I like to write. But it would have been, it's obviously easier if you're there to get the info at the time. So that said, that was a situation where doctors and nurses and their patients suffered with no electricity, no running water, under bombing, under shelling, surrounded with very little aid coming in for 3 years, not 5 days. So it would be easy to say that, New Orleans comparatively wasn't comparable. On the other hand is the fact that for Americans who are used to, I'm sure some of you unfortunately have had to go into a hospital for whatever reason, family member, personal illness, but we have very high-tech medicine, we have the best possible care, we rely now a lot on things that plug into a power outlet, and I think that makes us more vulnerable when we lack it. There are many parts of the world, such as West Africa, where the hospitals regularly don't have power, where the patients have to bring diesel to have their surgeries, to get the generator running so that there can be some power in the operating room. I mean, literally, this is the situation. No running water at a lot of them. So it's not that that's a good situation, but the doctors and nurses there deal with it every day. Here, it comes as a huge shock. A huge shock. We are totally unprepared. Our hospitals, like the windows don't open. If it's hot as heck, you can't open the window and get a breeze. So in some ways, that makes it even harder and more shocking and more of a chance that our doctors and nurses would just feel like, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. We're all going to die. The patients, there's nothing I can do for them. Well, there is, but we're not used to being able to think that way. So I think that for the people in this hospital who had very little exposure to low resource environments, let's say, for them it was their war, and they used the war analogy. And if you have a broader perspective of the world, you can say that that's not apt, but for them it felt that way, I'm sure.
I'm wondering what you feel like the American healthcare system could learn from the healthcare system as it exists in West Africa and dealing with Ebola, where the lack of resources is routine. People are more resourceful, as you said.
Yeah, I think what we need to learn, and what's going to be really good for our resilience, because hospitals all over the country, you can lose power in a snowstorm. That's happened. So it's not like, I feel like everywhere in the country, everywhere in the world, emergencies can happen, and we need to be prepared. And the best way to be prepared is to have a plan, but also to plan to be flexible. And that's the big lesson of Katrina. It's a big lesson of a lot of the emergencies that I worked in, and I want to share this with you because you're at that young, creative age and you're thinking outside the box, but don't lose that. That's key. In a crisis, you're always going to be thrown things that you're not prepared for. Like, take a deep breath and remember that, and remember to try to just keep reevaluating. What's the situation now? What's the situation now? What can I do? Can I be creative? Can I think of an unusual way to solve a problem? And that is really what we can take from these other places where people have to be creative all the time.
I was really struck by what your reporting reveals about what people are able and willing to believe in situations like what happened in New Orleans. And like for example, people apparently found it impossible to believe that their patients would be rescued. So they had to take these drastic steps. But at the same time, people, it seemed like, found it very easy to believe that there were mobs outside ready to storm the hospital and kill them all at any moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Panic. Yeah. So that's why you want to try to be just getting the best information possible. And at some point in your lives, you will be in charge of things. You might manage a hospital. You might have a leadership position. And so, there's that level of thinking about yourself and your own preparedness, but then there's about like your preparedness of your family or the company that you're running at the time. And then there's the preparedness of society and like how much we invest in, choose to invest in making our schools safer and making hospitals safer. And so those are all these different levels of how we can.
Well, we're used to thinking about disaster preparedness in terms of what are the evacuation plans and do you have supplies and equipment. And you really point up how the sort of the bioethical decision making is not very adequately included, or at least it wasn't in this case. That's a new thing that healthcare is going to have to get its head around to deal with situations like these. Who do you treat first? How should triage function?
Well, that's a question for all of us. I feel really strongly that it shouldn't just be doctors sitting there making that decision, because it's not just a medical question. When there's not enough to go around, that's a values question. That's like, do we want the young to get more resources because we feel like they're the future? Do we want, older people because they have the wisdom of society? It's all these things that aren't necessarily medical. And so if we don't talk about it, then we can't have that conversation. And then it's going to be a small group of doctors who have very specific training, who tend to come from the same kinds of backgrounds, who are going to make these decisions on behalf of society. And I just feel like it's worth us all discussing and having some say in it.
Yeah, I think you're so right about that, and I not only for that reason. Are we having a disaster? Because having that discussion will maybe make it easier for us to talk about the other ways in which those same dynamics are in play. In a disaster, you see sort of the priorities of how resources are allocated. It seems like a model that you could transpose onto all kinds of other public policy issues. How do we fund education? Which populations can be saved? Sort of kinds of questions. Do you buy that? Do you go along with that?
Well, there's this interesting movement that I learned about called participative democracy, and in fact, UPMC, which is that, I'm sure you all know it more than me, the big medical center here and educational institution, they have been participating in this sort of like an exercise. They're actually implementing it in the state of Maryland, where they're going all around the state and they're getting groups together just like this, and they're spending half a Saturday and they're kind of marching through how could you make these decisions? Would it be first come, first serve? Would it be a lottery? Let's say like the helicopters, who got on those helicopters first? all different principles that you could apply. Should the sickest go out first? Should the healthiest, because they have a better prognosis? And deliberative democracy means it's not just calling people up and saying, which way do you want to do it? It's giving them a half a day to learn about this, talk to experts about it, and then talk to their neighbors about it around tables, and then ask questions, and then express their point of view. And then that is being captured all over the state, and the people running this exercise are then feeding that info to the policymakers before that policy is set. And I think you could imagine, and it has been applied, this kind of philosophy has been applied to different problems like you just mentioned.
I think we need to start taking some questions.
Yeah, I want to hear from you guys.
We have one Twitter question by my count so far, and I'll just put that to you, and then while you guys are thinking of what you want to ask. And this comes from Madison. Is Madison here or elsewhere? Hey, Madison. The question is, do you want to ask your question, or should I just read the tweet?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Do you want to ask the question since you're here, or should I just read the tweet out loud?
No, I'll ask it. I was just wondering what made you make the book non-biased?
What made me make it non-biased?
Yeah, because there's many ways where you could have showed your personal opinion in it.
Yeah.
I was wondering why you did it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're right. I could have told it in a polemical way, or yeah. Well, I think it's two things. One is that when I learned about journalism, I trained as a doctor, but I did a journalism fellowship, and we did it's like miniature journalism school. You could get a degree in journalism. It was like that compressed into several months. And so I learned the ethics of American newspaper reporting, which is a very much in that model of the objective writer. And that's what I've taken into my writing since then is that distance of not putting yourself in it, of just trying to put the facts out there. And I also have felt always, I think, since high school that, when I'm sure you all have causes that you care about, probably. I mean, there's like daily things that you care about, but then maybe larger things in the community or things that make you really outraged and you want to change about the world. Well, for me, I always felt like if only people knew the truth, then you wouldn't have to tell them what to think, because the truth speaks sometimes louder than anything. And so it's kind of my idea is that if I just portray the facts, then people will take away the right conclusions, whatever right means. So I think for those two reasons, and then the fact that this was just one of those cases where you can see it through so many angles, and so many people I was speaking with who were part of the events saw it in different ways, that I wanted you to have all that before you make your decision. So that's why. Good question.
Other questions? Who's got one? Oh yeah, please have a seat. All right. What do you got?
You said that you worked in like Bosnia and stuff like that. Have you ever been put into a situation where you had to make a tough decision that could have affected somebody else's life?
Just repeat the question so they can hear us remotely.
The question was, in the work that I've done, whether I've ever been in a situation where I've had to make a tough choice that affects somebody's life. And I assume you mean kind of like that triage choice of which patients? Yeah. So there was a time right after med school, like right when I was finishing, that I was in Kosovo. There was a war. It was part of the Balkans wars in the 90s. And it was the first time that I had worked as an aid worker. There's like Doctors Without Borders and those other groups that send aid workers into war type situations. And so this was on a border where people were fleeing a war into like sort of a no man's land between two borders, trying to get to safety. And just 100,000 people showed up at this no man's land, and they weren't allowed into the other country. And so there was a medical aid tent, and I'd actually this was the year that I was researching my first book about Bosnia, and then this war in Kosovo broke out. And I had been sent there to do research on something that's called violations of medical neutrality. So this is the idea that in a war, there's actually laws and rules of war that are pretty widely accepted internationally. There's like war crimes law and the laws of war, Geneva Conventions. You may study them. I see people nodding. Yay, you know. And so when people target hospitals, doctors, patients in wartime, that can be considered a war crime. And so there was this group, Physicians for Human Rights, that sent me, this was before I was a journalist, sent me there they had heard rumors that the hospitals were being emptied in Kosovo where this war was, and that doctors were being killed and patients were being, appearing on this border in their gowns. And they sent me there to investigate that. But when I got to the border, there were like 100,000 people had showed up, and there was this aid group, International Medical Corps at the time, that was established there, and they just literally, they needed volunteers to help out. And so I ended up helping them do triage. So I was literally the person outside the tent deciding which patients would get in for medical care. So that's probably the closest that I've come to being that person having the weight of those decisions on my shoulders. And it was really remarkably similar to the Katrina scenario in that there were these young guys who were in this muddy no man's land between the borders, and they kept carrying people out to us. And the Macedonian police didn't let families come. So it would literally be, they were pulling out any vulnerable person. And so there were these elderly people who couldn't speak, who might have dementia. There were people with psychiatric problems. There were people who needed assistance, who were coming without their families, without any kind of context, and they were being brought up to our tent at the same time someone who's having an apparent heart attack is. So how do you decide how to care for someone who's totally dependent versus someone who is dying of a heart attack? So those same kinds of issues came into play, and one thing that I think disasters always show us is there's this vulnerable segment of society. There's always people who really need that extra help in a crisis, and we need to think about them. And they're kind of vulnerable every day, and we kind of ignore them sometimes, these segments of society. And in a crisis, you really see that. You really see these people very clearly who need that extra help. Yeah. Long answer to your question.
Thank you.
Who else has a question? Do you want to come up and have a seat?
So I'm just curious about your stance around euthanization and what your opinion is on it. So we've already sort of established that the medical doctors within Memorial their perception was sort of closing to their options around, right? Mm-hmm. They saw euthanization as their only option. And
some of them, yeah, there was big debate about it even at the time, right? Because some of them said, "Oh my God, they're we don't do this. This is unethical," and others said, "We have to do this." So there was debate even at that time. But yes, some of them did feel that way for sure.
Right, and you believe that you previously mentioned that you think there were other options, right? They still had resources that they could have drawn. So I'm wondering, from your background working with reporting of Bosnians and such in the war zone, especially in those times, were there any circumstances in which you see euthanization as the only option?
So there, I'll tell you from the perspective of experts who I interviewed, because I don't consider myself, I'm just writing about them, but there are people who kind of spend their careers really thinking about these subjects. And one really smart guy said to me, he looked at the Katrina events. This was before we really knew what happened, so he didn't have he just had the allegations. It was early on. And he said if you ever truly had the case where your only choices were hastening patients' deaths or abandoning them, then he said you could imagine that either one would be, now I can't remember the difference between justifiable or excusable. There's a difference there. It's one word or the other. I think excusable. You could kind of excuse either action because both are really, really against medical ethics. You never abandon your patient, you never kill your patient. Those are two really profound aspects of what doctors and nurses believe and in current medical ethics. And so he came up with that idea that in that case. And so you could imagine if they really were in the situation at Memorial where they had to get out, their own lives were under, duress, then they could make either choice. But the thing is, they weren't in that situation in this case. And so that's kind of the conclusion.
So from a qualitative aspect, it's devoid of any emotion. If it comes down to just those two choices, abandoning the patient or euthanizing them, that specific doctor, sorry, what did you say the expert's name was?
That was, I'm trying to remember who came up with that formulation. I think it's, I can't remember his name right now, but if somebody emails me after, I can try to find, because I think he actually wrote a paper you might find on the internet about it. But yeah, I can't remember. But he's a medical ethicist. That's his profession. Yeah.
So qualitatively, he's saying that it's better to euthanize your patient.
No.
Oh.
He was saying either choice is horrible, but if those are your only two choices, then you could kind of excuse either one because they were in this no-win situation. But I think what we want to be thinking about is always how can we kind of avoid either one. It's not like, but if you truly, truly were in that situation where you were forced to make a choice between only those two options, then he was saying you could kind of excuse either one.
Okay. I have one more question, if you don't mind. I don't want to take up other people's time.
He's the moderator.
Keep it short.
Okay. So with the trials and such, and the decision of the grand jury not to indict not to indict the doctors who allegedly committed euthanization. What do you think of that decision? Do you think, we sort of already talked about how perhaps we lost something in a discussion we had, but do you think some amount of truth was lost there?
Well, the criticism that the prosecutors had of that process was that the grand jury never heard all the evidence. And Cyril Wecht, do you guys know Dr. Wecht? He's the famous coroner here who recently left office. I'm not sure how many years ago, but he's kind of a famous figure here, and he was one of the experts that was brought in because the coroner in New Orleans he was like a gynecologist. He wasn't an expert on death investigations, even though he was coroner. They elect their coroners. And so in any case, Dr. Wecht, other experts had looked very carefully at this case and had come up with the idea that these were homicides. And that's not assigning blame. That's just a medical determination that one human being's actions led to the death of another human being. There can be all sorts of reasons why that would happen, that the person wouldn't go to jail. But basically the prosecutors felt like the grand jury didn't hear from the experts. They didn't hear from the families. They barely heard from the life care nurses. I think they only heard from one of them. So the critics of that process said that it wasn't a valid process because the grand jury didn't have all the evidence. But, me personally, I wouldn't say it should have gone to trial or this should have happened or that should have happened. Like what happened. And I just regret that more information wasn't available to the public so that we could have this discussion. But fortunately, over years, I was able to, piece together, I think, a vast part of it. I still think there's things that we don't know that would be good to know, and that maybe with time we'll know more.
Just really quickly, sorry. Do you think there would have been more? Do you think there would have been something you would have known if she had been convicted, and then the records could have been released, right?
Well, if Dr. Poe had gone on trial, she might have taken the stand, and then we would hear what she has to say. And that's really the one thing we don't know is what was going on in her mind. And she won't discuss that really very specifically. She's just maintained her innocence, and that should be said, that she says she's not a murderer, and that her actions weren't criminal. And but it would be nice, I think it would be a service to the public to know more. So maybe she would have taken the stand or had to be go through a deposition, a process by which she would have to answer questions on swearing to be honest. And so that might have been a good thing in terms of more information out there. But that's not how our legal system isn't based on, what would serve public information. Again, it's served around this issue of prosecution.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Everybody, let's have a hand for Sheri Fink. I'm so sorry, we're out of time for the Q&A, but I think she'd be willing to answer your questions if you'll approach her afterwards. You're going to hang around and maybe sign some books, I think.
Yeah, I'm
there's
happy
time.
to take a few more questions.
So,
if people want.
thank you all for coming. Thanks for your smart questions and your attention.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to again thank the sponsors of today's event, which are Allegheny County, Dollar Bank Foundation, Highmark, WYEP, and again thanks to Josh and Dr. Fink for engaging with us today. So thanks.
Never tell with these things.